During Queen Elizabeth's reign and carrying over to King James's reign were a set of strict religious regulations known as the Penal Laws. These laws made it illegal to practice any religion other than the Church of England and required weekly attendance to state-sponsored church services. This oppressive situation led closeted Catholic priests to meet in secret with Puritan leaders to discuss a plot to kidnap James shortly after his ascension to force him to give more freedoms to religious minorities. The Puritans were a sect of English Protestants who believed that the Church of England was a corrupted version of the Protestant Church, one which they did not want to be a part of. Unbeknownst to the Puritans, stark internal divisions within the Catholic priests were going to jeopardize the plan known as the Biplot. Some of the priests had been appointed by the Pope to go to England and convert the people and were led by George Blackwell. The local English priests, led by William Watson, rejected the efforts of the externally appointed priests to exert control, and both sides began a fierce propaganda campaign to discredit each other by distributing pamphlets to their followers. With the brazenness of the propaganda campaign, Blackwell became nervous it would be discovered by the authorities and preemptively expose the plot to King James. As a result, James ordered the expulsion of all Catholic priests from England. A trial was held, but the defendants were pardoned because through their testimony, they exposed an even bigger plot known as the Main Plot. The mastermind of the plan was Lord Cobham, who had the ultimate goal of replacing James with his cousin, Lady Arbella. Cobham secretly traveled to Spain via the Spanish Netherlands to obtain a large sum of money from the Spanish government, who wanted to fund the overthrow of Protestant rule in England. He then sailed to the island of Jersey, where Sir Walter Raleigh was governor. Raleigh was in on the plot and was going to receive half the money to compensate him for allowing Jersey to be the base of operations for the mission. Both men were imprisoned in the Tower of London indefinitely. Raleigh was released 13 years later so the kingdom could utilize his skills as a navigator to lead a new expedition to Guyana, traveling up the Orinoco River. The purpose of the expedition was to try and find El Dorado, and Raleigh was given the specific orders not to attack any Spanish in the area. Raleigh lost control of his men, and they pillaged and slaughtered an unsuspecting Spanish settlement. On return to England, the furious Spanish ambassador to England demanded that Raleigh be executed. James had no other choice but to behead Raleigh in 1618. Cobham was released the same year, but because of poor health, he succumbed to his illness a few months later. During Elizabeth's reign, she greatly utilized a small group of advisors known as the Privy Council to help her make many different decisions, ranging from plans for war to management of the treasury. Many English citizens, especially the barons, were hoping that the Privy Council would go away under James and be replaced with a more permanent parliament to represent the people. This change did not occur, however, as James did not want to have to deal with the day-to-day runnings of the kingdom, so he could focus on his goal of a united Britain. In 1605, tensions continued, stemming from the religious intolerance, leading to a group of Catholic dissidents to plan to secretly stock the cellars of the Royal Parliament building with explosives, with the goal of blowing the building up while in session, killing the king. The day before the so-called gunpowder plot was to occur, conspirator Guy Fawkes was found in the cellar guarding barrels of gunpowder, and the plot was thwarted. All the conspirators were executed. The following year, James ordered the colonization of Ireland by establishing the Ulster Plantation by confiscating land from Gaelic chiefs located in Northern Ireland. The Ulsters were English and Scottish Protestant settlers who had the dream of farming their own land, something that was no longer possible in overcrowded England. In 1607, additional Protestant settlers began to settle in the Americas, founding the colony of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. England was behind other coastal European kingdoms, such as Portugal and Spain, who had already established lucrative colonies around the world, focused on subjugating the local populations and using them to extract raw resources. The gold-producing lands of South America had already been taken, so the English settlers were relegated to temperate North America and instead had the focus of founding permanent settlements to reduce overcrowding at home, as well as to solve a lumber shortage on Great Britain. So King James may be most notable today for commissioning an updated and revised Bible known as the King James Version. He died in 1625 and was followed by his son, Charles. Charles was a strong supporter of his divine right to rule, and he immediately dismissed Parliament so that he could have sole personal rule. It is important to note that governing bodies such as Parliament or the Privy Council were set up by the king or queen and given certain powers so that the ruler could focus on issues of their choosing or simply to live a life of leisure if they chose. Up to this point, Parliament sessions were sporadic events where the king would call a group of nobles from around the kingdom to come to a great meeting so that he could hear their advice on how to proceed with critical issues such as going to war or raising taxes. The latter was especially important after the signing of the Magna Carta, which stipulated that the king could not introduce new taxes without the consent of the people. Charles was also a strong Anglican and worked to bring Anglicanism to Scotland. The Scots resisted this, and a war broke out known as the First Bishops' War in 1639. The Scots won, and the Presbyterianism remained the official religion of the kingdom. While Anglicanism advocated intermixing church and state, Presbyterianism instead supported individual church congregations electing their own members, known as presbyters, to volunteer to fulfill the duties that would otherwise be carried out by a bishop. The church was founded by Protestant reformer John Knox, independently from the Church of England. Even after it had become clear England had lost the war, Charles wanted to continue, so he recalled Parliament in 1640 to request more funding, something they denied. Charles then again dismissed Parliament only after 3 weeks of being in session, giving it the name the Short Parliament. Underfunded, he then went on to lose the Second Bishops' War and was forced to sign the unfavorable Treaty of Ripon with the Covenanters. Which were the militant wing of the Presbyterian Church. In the treaty, the Scots occupied some northern English territory and were paid a daily rent. The Covenanters stated that this would not cease until further negotiations could be made with a parliamentary body. This forced Charles to recall Parliament again for a second time in the same year. The Covenanters believed Charles was secretly a Catholic, and they required Parliament to hold elections to rid it of its Catholic influence. A large majority was won by the opposition, led by John Pym. Another new requirement was that only Parliament could now vote to dismiss itself, with this new sense of permanence leading to the session being called the Long Parliament. Almost immediately, the Long Parliament began debating controversial legislation known as the Root and Branch petitions, which aimed to remove all Catholic influence from government and to deconstruct the system of bishops where religious figures held power in Parliament. Parliament was bicameral in that it was made up of two houses that had gradually formed over time. The House of Lords, which represented the voice of the nobles and the church, and then the House of Commons, which was made up of the burgesses, which were elected officials from different towns throughout England. Charles pushed back against efforts to disenfranchise the bishops, and because he was king, Parliament could not directly attack him, so they began a smear campaign on one of his closest nobleman allies to gain leverage over him in future dealings. This ally was Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Stratton. Wentworth had earlier been appointed Deputy of Ireland, where he ruled an authoritarian regime that instigated violence and abuse against the local Irish. Parliament used this past as an excuse to arrest him and imprison him in the Tower of London. Rumors began to spread that supporters of Charles were plotting to mobilize the royal army to free Wentworth from captivity, which caused widespread public outrage and forced the more moderate House of Lords' hands in voting to have Wentworth beheaded for his past crimes. Only now that Parliament had the leverage did they approve Charles' funding requests, with the additional requirement that Parliament must meet at least 50 days every 3 years. In 1641, a rebellion broke out in occupied Ireland over the suppression of Irish Catholics. Both Charles and Parliament wanted to send an army to quell the rebellion, but both sides distrusted each other, and more radical members of the House of Commons began to accuse the bishops in the House of Lords for impeding on legislative progress. The inaction consequently led to the Irish overthrowing English control and establishing the self-ruled Irish Catholic Confederation. The radicals, led by John Pym, presented Charles with a long list of grievances and demands called the Grand Remonstrance. Chiefly, it asked for the removal of bishops from the House of Lords and the transfer of military privileges to Parliament. This proved to be divisive and caused many moderate members of the House of Lords to switch sides to support Charles, who were now known as the Royalists, with their rivals being the Parliamentarians, who were joined by the Scots, and who believed the church should be independent and that a functioning constitutional monarchy should be formed. Charles then ordered the arrest of the radical members of the House of Commons on charges of treason. Parliament heard of the planned arrest ahead of time and disbanded and allowed the members to evade capture. Outfoxed, Charles decided to leave London with the royalists and moderate members of the House of Lords to set up a new home base in Oxford, farther from the forces of Parliament. This proved to be a huge mistake as Parliament began swiftly passing more contentious bills. The Clergy Act fulfilled their promise of removing bishops from government, and the Militia Ordinance gave them the authority to raise and order local militias across England. At this point, the idea of a national army was unheard of, and these defensive duties were instead handled by smaller local militias who were assigned a barracks to protect the local community. This was the last straw for Charles, and he issued the Commission of Array, calling on supporters of the king everywhere to organize and defend the kingdom. Fighting broke out in 1642 in what was known as the First English Civil War. The Royalists experienced some initial success, but were decisively defeated at the Battle of Marston Moor. However, the parliamentarians were unable to capitalize on this and stalled in their objectives. The parliamentarians switched tactics and decided to form a national army known as the New Model Army, commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. The king's army was no match for the united might of the national army, and in 1645, Oxford, the last royalist stronghold, was on the verge of defeat. While the Scots were fighting alongside the parliamentarians, they were also nervous of England being dominated exclusively by a radical Puritan parliament that may look to interfere with Presbyterianism, and they were open with negotiation with Charles. In 1646, Charles left Oxford wearing a disguise and maneuvered his way through enemy territory until he reached the Scottish army and surrendered himself. The Scots notified Parliament that they were now in custody of the king, and negotiations were made to end the fighting, with the Scots pulling back their occupying forces to Newcastle, ending the First English Civil War. The Scots wanted to restore Charles in exchange for him agreeing to make Presbyterianism the new state religion across not just Scotland, but England and Ireland as well. Charles refused, so the Scots instead handed him over to Parliament in exchange for a monetary sum. The soldiers of the New Model Army were restless, as they had not yet been paid for their services in the First Civil War. After acts of disobedience, Parliament ordered the New Model Army to be disbanded, something they refused, which caused a break between them. As a result, the Presbyterian members of Parliament resigned, and the New Model Army captured Charles and held him in captivity on the island of Wight, attempting to pressure him to sign a more moderate peace agreement, which requested a constitutional monarchy without the forced introduction of Presbyterianism as the new state religion of the three kingdoms. Charles saw this division as a political opportunity and began to renegotiate with the Scots and English Presbyterians on what it would take for them to support him and help reinstate him properly on the throne. He proposed that if they could secure the throne, Presbyterianism could become the state religion for a trial period of 3 years, something the Scots reluctantly agreed to. In 1648, Scottish forces invaded England with the goal of defeating the New Model Army, starting the Second English Civil War. Royalists across England began rising up and joining the fight, which included the Royal Navy, which had yet to be integrated with the New Model Army. The Royalist plan was uncoordinated, however, and the attack soon fizzled out, with Parliament voting for Charles to come to the table and renegotiate their terms for a constitutional monarchy. New Model Army members loyal to Oliver Cromwell thought it was useless to negotiate with Charles, who they saw as a tyrant. In 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride of the New Model Army ordered the mass arrest of all Parliament members who did not support toppling the monarchy in what was known as Pride's Purge, which ended the Long Parliament in a coup and began the so-called Rump Parliament. In 1649, the Rump Parliament tried King Charles for treason and found him guilty, sentencing him to death by beheading. Charles' oldest son, Charles II, then became King of Scotland and Ireland, but did not have claim to England and Wales, as Parliament had declared themselves a republic called the Commonwealth of England. Oliver Cromwell immediately began a military campaign to reconquer Ireland, where he put Charles Fleetwood in command, while he himself began a preemptive strike on Scotland out of fear Charles II was raising an army to topple the republic, beginning the Third and final English Civil War. The Scots were decisively defeated at Worcester, with Charles II being one of the few to escape destruction by hiding out in a tall oak tree and eventually making his way to France. Scotland was then forced to join into the Commonwealth in 1652, shortly followed by success in Ireland the following year. Today it is common to refer to the three civil wars singularly as the English Civil War, or sometimes the War of Three Kingdoms. Parliament passed the act for the settlement of Ireland that required the forced migration of many Irish from a bulk of the island to the small northwestern corner of it on the opposite side of the River Shannon, with their homelands being confiscated and given to allies of Cromwell.